Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. So I hope you've been enjoying all the content we've been putting out. By the way, I should say Paris, Seoul, Tokyo, because some people were actually asking about that. So today's topic is one I've wanted to do for a long time. Since we started doing these opinion videos, really, there's a lot of potentially controversial opinions on this topic and around this topic, and so I hope everyone can keep a level head as we think about this and discuss this. I don't think this video is going to have much B-roll, and you'll probably see in a second why. But let me kind of set the stage for the topic. Well, I'll just hit you with what the topic is. Why I don't think ride sharing is the worst thing in the world. Now, I'm going to be very specific here and just kind of set down some ground rules. First of all, I'm not going to name any companies because I'm sure you can do your own searching and finding out about some of the really bad things a lot of the companies in this space have been doing or have done. That's bad. I agree that's bad. I agree that breaking the law and not following local regulations and orders, etc., that's also bad. There's a lot of bad things that ride-sharing companies have done, but ride-sharing in itself is not something I think is inherently bad. So I'm going to kind of split this video into three parts. I'm going to start with talking about why I think ride-sharing has become so successful, particularly in North America. Second, I'm going to talk about kind of why I think that that's not necessarily a bad thing. And then third, I'm going to talk about how I think things need to change. Before I get started, actually, I have to do something. I want to shout out our latest patrons, Matthew, Nicholas, Ryan, and Chris. Thanks for supporting us, guys. We appreciate it a ton. We hope you enjoy the content, and yeah, if you want to support us on Patreon, we really appreciate it. So, back to the scheduled content. So I'm going to start with why I think ride-sharing has become so successful in really many parts of the world. And I should point out that another reason I'm not going to mention particular companies is that different countries actually have a number of different offerings for ride-sharing and etc. So I think it makes it more universally applicable if I just stay out of naming names. So the first thing I want to point out is that ride-sharing is often funded by large kind of investors, etc., who want to boost startups that are promising kind of major profits and that sort of thing, though it doesn't appear that any ride-sharing company is actually making very much money right now. It's unfortunate, but it appears to be the truth. So, to some degree, ride-sharing is artificially encouraged and artificially appears less expensive than it probably would be otherwise because it's backed by a ton of institutional and non-institutional kind of private equity folks, etc. And so there's basically a lot of money in it, and that draws down prices and makes a lot of things that wouldn't otherwise be possible, kind of low wages and that sort of thing, which is obviously terrible. A large part of why I think ride-sharing is so successful in North America is because, as I'm sure as viewers of the channel you know, transit is just not as successful in North America as it is in many areas of Europe and Asia, as unfortunate as it is. And I should also point out that a lot of the opinions I'm sharing here are controversial in a lot of circles that are kind of urbanist and pro-transit and pro-equity and pro-environment, because ride-sharing is terrible and it's just putting more cars on the road, right? And we should fight it tooth and nail. The reality is I don't think it's like that, and I think that generally these kind of wide platitudes are not helpful in debates. I think that they're not really pragmatic. Pragmatism is really important when it comes to actually solving problems we face. I don't think it's possible to just suddenly make a 90-degree turn for society, industry, the way the world is structured. And for that reason, I think ride-sharing and often other things are important to consider when we're talking about how do we improve equity, how do we improve our cities, how do we improve the environment. You just can't change things so quickly. And the good thing about ride-sharing is that it enables people to live a more transit and perhaps more environmentally focused life without necessarily living in an area where transit is currently successful in North America. The reality is that a lot of the built environment in North America is just not super conducive to transit. A lot of places where transit is successful have significant density, so we're talking about major cities in different locations, even though there are some major cities, Los Angeles among others, where transit still isn't that successful, even though the city is of course very large and on average quite dense. And the reality is that even if we do get people to use transit more, we do all those sort of things, these built environments just aren't really designed well for transit to be successful. They're often not really accessible for walking and cycling, which is a big booster for transit because people typically don't drive to a bus stop, they walk to a bus stop or they cycle to a train stop, etc. So this type of built environment just isn't really conducive to transit. Not that I'm saying we shouldn't try to build transit. I'm just saying that there's a reason ride-sharing has succeeded, and it's because it's pretty well adapted because it's using cars, which are exactly what our current built environment in much of North America was designed to be based around. I also want to point out the fact that there's definitely reasons for even someone like me to use ride-sharing. Now, to be clear, I've only used ride-sharing probably 5 times in my entire life, but I think each of those times, it was for a good reason. Sometimes it's because there isn't transit to where you need to go. That's something that exists, and unfortunately no amount of loving transit or hating cars is going to make transit connect to all the destinations we necessarily might want it to. And the reality is that people can't necessarily wait for transit lines to be built, bus routes to start, the environment around society and how people feel about transit to change to get to their job or to get to other locations that they might want to get to. And so ride-sharing can fill that gap. Another time I've actually had to use ride-sharing is, for example, leaving somewhere late at night when nighttime transit service, even a big city like Toronto, just wasn't going to get me to where I needed to go. Unfortunately, that's just the reality of transit networks, is that even in major cities where transit is considered very good, there isn't always a great nighttime network. And again, this is a place where ride-sharing can make a lot of sense. Another example would be when you're carrying a lot of stuff. For example, at airports, while I love the connectivity for travelers to get directly off a plane and onto a train or a bus, it's not always practical. For example, when you're doing a short business trip or kind of a weekend getaway, sure, you might only have a backpack or a small suitcase and it's easy enough to get on a bus or a train. But when you're doing a long haul flight or some sort of move or anything like that and you have several suitcases, it's hard enough to get from the curb or the train station at the airport to the gate itself, much less to your final destination. And so it's just not always realistic that people are going to take transit for every trip. And the reality is that even in places where transit is very successful, cars still exist. We don't, of course, cars play a more limited role, but that's all I'm saying here. There's niches for every mode, and again, ride-sharing has a niche. Now, to be perfectly clear, I should also mention there's one other big reason I think ride-sharing has been so successful, and that's because, well, it is innovative to a degree. In the past, taxi service, for example, was just never a great option. If you've used a taxi, which I'm sure many people have, you know that taxis are typically old vehicles, they're often dirty, it's kind of an uncomfortable situation because you have to make sure you're watching the meter in many places. The actual experience of getting a taxi can be quite difficult. You may have to call a number and get them to dispatch a taxi to you, or you may need to literally flag a taxi down. It's just not a great experience. And I think that's, to a large extent, what caused ride-sharing to be so successful. Because essentially, when you think about it, ride-sharing is just a taxi service or a car service. Now, to be perfectly clear, many taxi companies, etc., have started to implement apps and that sort of thing. But the problem is, if you're reactionary in these type of moments when innovation is important, then you just aren't first and you don't have that first mover advantage and other people can overtake you. Now, to be clear, I think that ride sharing, etc., really should be playing by the same rules as taxis in terms of regulations, etc. And I think these things need to be more tightly regulated because the number of times I've almost been hit by a taxi or a ride sharing vehicle in a city like Toronto is crazy. That being said, I do think that the taxi industry made many mistakes in providing poor customer service and not kind of innovating, which led to ride-sharing being so successful. And let's be honest, being able to pick up your phone, see all the vehicles around you, and be able to choose a destination and have a car there in a couple of minutes is impressive. It's something that didn't exist a few years ago, and now that we have that, people are impressed and people will tend to use it. Now, why I don't necessarily think ride-sharing isn't a bad thing. I guess I've kind of already started talking about this a bit, but let's continue. First of all, a lot of people talk about ride-sharing as if it's going to kill other forms of mobility. But let's be honest, ride-sharing still in many places won't be as convenient as transit, and ride-sharing is expensive. See, people often compare ride-sharing to taxis when they say ride-sharing is not that expensive. But when you look at the cost of ride-sharing from one place in the city to another, in many cities that would be a flat transit fare of only a few dollars, whereas with ride-sharing, it's often over $30 or $40 to get across a large city. And so, no, ride-sharing isn't really affordable. And can you imagine paying $40 twice a day for every day so that you could commute to and from work? It's clear that ride-sharing just isn't really oriented towards that sort of system. Of course, there are things like pooled ride-sharing, etc., and I think those things are great. You lower the cost to riders and you can get them to a place where transit may not have great service. That's a win-win. And again, a fully loaded private automobile is much better than a single person in a private automobile. So from a pragmatic standpoint, actually getting more people in a car, if that car is going to be driving, is a good thing. We should also point out the fact that if someone's driving a car every day for a ride-sharing company, for example, they're more likely to care about the efficiency of their car and their cost to operate and the emissions, etc., because that's something that they have to directly pay for. If you're owning a car, well, you don't drive it that much, and so you don't care as much if your car is super efficient, which I think means that people who are using ride-sharing apps, if they're really caring about it, they're probably trying to be more efficient drivers, use less fuel, be more efficient, and so that perhaps means that if we're replacing a car journey that someone else would have been taking with a ride-sharing one, well, at a minimum, you're probably going to have more people in the car, but it's also probably a more efficient car. So I think that's another positive you can think about. Now, probably the biggest positive I personally see is that ride-sharing can be a comfort tool that brings people over from the side of, I need to own a car, to, I can survive primarily using transit, but I know that ride-sharing exists if I need it. I think it's a really critical point, because not having to make another car or manufacture another car, allowing people to go car-free, is one of the biggest benefits of ride-sharing in my personal opinion. Providing that kind of stopgap where if I need to go to IKEA and load up a vehicle full of stuff, I can do that. Of course, IKEA delivers, but my point still stands. That kind of comfort and that flexibility that ride-sharing does sometimes provide could be the thing, and I think it is in many cases a thing that's allowing people to go car-free. You can use transit most of the time, but say you need to go somewhere far away or again inaccessible by transit, ride-sharing is there. Now, if that means that a lot of people can ditch their cars, particularly in urban areas, well then ride-sharing is a massive win. And furthermore, in places like more commuter-oriented communities, if ride-sharing can be a great first mile, last mile opportunity so that people can get on a train and do the majority of their journey on a train, that's also fantastic. It's also worth pointing out that in many cases, ride-sharing has been so successful because our transit is weak. And while that's not necessarily good for transit, I think if your transit is really solid and really convenient, again, ride-sharing just can't win. For example, imagine a trip from Pearson Airport in Toronto to downtown. The trip is going to cost more in a ride-sharing vehicle, it's probably going to be slower in a ride-sharing vehicle, and you don't get the great view of a train. And so, at the end of the day, I still think ride-sharing can't win in many key areas where transit is successful and can continue to remain successful. I really think of it as a fringe thing that will be popular in the long term, primarily for only those select journeys I was talking about. Again, a lot of these companies aren't super profitable, and so what I imagine will happen is slowly the cost of them will go up, and the kind of attractiveness for trips that could probably be done using transit or walking or biking will go way down, and ride-sharing will be in a bit of a better place. It'll also probably provide a more reasonable wage for people who want to drive for a living, because there is flexibility there, and that is valuable. As the price slowly goes up, people will likely earn more money doing ride-sharing, and I think that's a good thing, because people don't deserve to be paid very little for the work they're doing. Just because someone's driving a car doesn't mean they still don't deserve a good wage, etc. And so I think that's a key point to make as well. So finally, I do want to talk a bit about what do I think needs to change in terms of ride-sharing. Well, first of all, I think the rationalization where people realize that ride-sharing is probably just unlikely to be that profitable long-term because certain trips make more sense on transit or biking or walking, turns ride-sharing companies into more of a niche enterprise that serves the routes I was talking about. I think I'd also be supportive of transit organizations kind of getting together and creating perhaps an application that allows transit services to operate on-demand transit that's more similar to ride-sharing. So it's more convenient, faster, yet still provides a good trip. I think that makes a lot of sense because it, from a cost model, makes more sense if you need to bring the cost down to have people perhaps subsidize a large rural area to have this sort of transit service. And that's not necessarily a negative thing, because if you can have a huge catchment area, you can feed your more dense areas of your network with a lot more people who otherwise might have driven. I also think ride-sharing existing in a bubble is something else that needs to change. I'm very happy to see that some ride-sharing companies have integrated transit into their apps, but not all have, and not all have done as good of a job as I would have liked. Again, it's about bringing ride-sharing into a space where it's filling in niche trips that wouldn't make sense necessarily on transit, and basically just helping transit be more attractive, which is something, again, I think it's really done. At the end of the day, I think I've said what I want to say. The reality is that ride-sharing is something that's probably not going away, but is something that also I think has some benefits in a couple of key areas. Like a lot of things, it's not going to solve all of our problems, but I think it can definitely reduce the damage of, for example, everyone owning a car or families owning multiple cars. If it can reduce our dependence on cars, that can slowly move us towards a more transit-oriented lifestyle and city building and development, which again just serves to make transit more popular and reduces the need for such services long term. Of course, this isn't something that's going to happen overnight, but again, that's exactly why it's so important. Ride-sharing is something that we have today that can serve areas that just aren't attractive for transit, and even in areas where transit is attractive, again, transit takes time, and ride-sharing is something that we have today. So what I think is important is to consider ride-sharing as a piece of a larger puzzle. It's not something that can ever replace transit, but it is something that can take a ton of single occupant cars off the roads, as well as make people a bit more friendly towards the idea of not always being in their own car or driving their own car. And while I think it's often something that we're negative about the sharing economy, especially in areas like software, where it feels weird to not own something, you really want to own it yourself, I think cars are exactly the type of thing that you shouldn't want to own. They're expensive, and getting rid of them entirely is a great way of basically cutting a ton of expenses you usually spend on vehicles totally out of your life. So, those are my thoughts on ride sharing. I hope you guys really enjoyed the video. Leave your comments down below. Keep it civil. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.